Afternoon. And it's really nice to see so many faces joining us today. Welcome. My name is Jane Crowley. I'm the Director of Health and the Environment for the town of Eastham. And I am just going to give you a quick introduction. I invited, my Board of Health has invited George Hoyfelder here today to talk to us about an experimental leach field that he is piloting elsewhere on the Cape. We do have some handouts in the front, and there's also a white paper that documents the performance of those systems. George did that paper in December of 2018, so it's pretty current. I have that link on our website, so I did not make copies of it today, but I think you could also probably find it on the Barnstable County website. Yes. Okay. So just George really doesn't need any kind of introduction because I think most of us know George, but George is the co-director of the Mass Test Center. He's formerly the director of Barnstable County Department of Health and the Environment. And today, George, we've invited him to talk about his experimental leach field. And I'd just like to kind of preface this with some questions maybe that you could be thinking about during his presentation. Selfishly, I'm looking at this from Eastham's perspective. So the things that I really want us to be thinking about is this type of approach of interest to the town of Eastham? Some just logistics. How difficult are these systems to install? How difficult are they to design? And how effectively will they be performing in terms of our goal, removing nitrogen from the septic system effluent? The map over here on the side is shaded in two different areas. That highlights, that is a map, thank you. That map, it identifies the area that contributes, that's defined by the Massachusetts Estuary Program, and those watersheds discharge into the Nauset Harbor estuarine system. So those two shaded areas need nitrogen reduction. Those two shaded areas are the ones that we will be focusing on for potentially installing demonstration systems to see how this technology can work in our own backyard. So the main source of the nutrient causing issues with our estuary is nitrogen. Eastham is looking at these non-traditional approaches as well as traditional approaches to meet the water quality standard that's required to have a healthy ecosystem. So with that in mind, I'm very interested that we have a mixed audience of installers, designers, interested citizens, so we can hear the conversation, and if funding is approved in FY20, look for some volunteers to come forward, some property owners that might be interested in having this type of technology in their backyard, so we as a community can evaluate its efficiency in removing nitrogen from the septic effluent. It's a passive system, and the town will be offsetting the cost, subsidizing, if you will, the extra cost that would be incurred by the property owner. So with those remarks and those thoughts, hopefully, George will answer all our questions and solve all our problems. Just that.
No pressure there. Solve all your problems. I love it. First of all, thank you for coming. This particular technology that I'm going to discuss has been called the layer cake, but I want to dispel any rumors that there'll be cake and coffee afterwards in any form of a layer. But right now, I think Eastham has had a long history with the County Health Department. There are a number of experimental systems that have been tried here. Some of them are still in and they're still working. Most of them have been mechanical units. There's been one passive unit right down here at the First Encounter Church. If you know, there's a peat system installed there which removed pathogens to a great extent, nitrogen not so much. That was pioneered by Dr. Joni Brooks up at the University of Maine. And we installed 2 or 3 of those around the Cape. Some of them are still in use today. And this follows a very similar vein where we have been looking at trying to figure out the simplest, most sustainable systems out there to remove the contaminants we need to remove from our wastewater. And I'm a great fan of my uncle Albert Einstein, who said, you know, everything should be as simple as possible, but not simpler. So what we've really done is taken a lot of the principles that we've found from demonstration projects across the country and tried to integrate them and see what their relevance is in our particular climate, in our area, and mostly to make sure they work. So, standard Title V system, so that you get a real good handle on that. I think we all know what it is. Today it is a septic tank, and it's a leach field, and generally the removal of that is roughly 20 to 30%. And I do need to go over sort of a real quick review of the standard system and system installation here on Cape Cod, because it relates very heavily to how we've modified that particular approach to maximize the nitrogen removal. And I will say sort of parenthetically that way back when we came to the Cape, when folks came to the Cape and disposed of their wastewater, they looked to the old Chapter 11 and the new Title V. And Title V has evolved over the years from basically something that disposed of our waste to something that at least minimally treats our waste. And because we live on a 60-mile-long sand spit, pretty much, it was pretty easy to get rid of our waste because we have very coarse sandy soils. In some areas we do have some clays and things that stop the water from going down through. But generally, the major strategy has been strip out that stuff that slows it down, get to that stuff that really makes it go away, and use that for our septic systems. So right now we have typically the A and B horizon, which are sand, sandy loam, sometimes some organics. We strip that away and dig down to the stuff that we really can get rid of the waste, and that's in the C horizon. And that's the sandy stuff that if you pour water on it as quickly as you can empty one bucket to go and get it filled up again, the water has gone away, much like at the beach. And so what happens when you do something like that is you dispose of the waste in the most biologically inactive area there is. You don't rely on God's good biology up top that allows the plants to grow or it allows the trees to get water from the soil. And you get down into the sand and you dispose of your wastewater. You create a new little environment down there, but for the most part, you don't get a whole lot of treatment. Not unless you put a lot of distance between where you treat and where you're pulling out for drinking water, do you get enough treatment to say, okay, I've got rid of the nitrogen, I've got rid of the phosphorus, I've got rid of everything I need to, because generally what you're relying on there is the best dilution. And, you know, I hearken back to my graduate school years when I paid a lot to go to graduate school. And the first thing the instructor wrote on the board was, the solution to pollution is dilution. I said, I'm paying $20,000 a year for somebody to write something like that. But in essence, that's what the strategy is or has been when you have really sandy soils. But not quite that, because in our soils, we'll generally get 20 to 30% removal of the nitrogen from a standard Title V system designed and operated properly. And a lot of times, as you'll find out as you go through the MEP reports or the mass estuaries reports that report on how much nitrogen can get there before you start sending things to hell in a handbasket, you need to remove more than 20 to 30%. So that's where the county's health department efforts have been over the past 20 years, is trying to find out, are there small treatment units that won't kill you, put in your backyard, that can do that? Because we realize that of all of Cape Cod, at the most, 50% of Cape Cod will probably be served by some sort of municipal sewer or some packaged treatment units, and that's really stretching it. I don't think we'll ever get to 50%, but that's about it. So what the county health department did years ago is invest a lot of effort to try to find out what are the best units we can use in our backyards, what are the constraints on them, what are the power usages, what are the cost, and are there simpler ways to do it? Because the more we strive for those simpler ways to do it, of course, they're more sustainable, particularly if they don't use as much power. But it also causes the on-site industry, which is inventing these little black boxes, to push for lower power consumption, simpler mechanisms. And like I say, everything should be as simple as possible, but not simpler. So there are things that we've been experimenting with, which are fairly simple. They're modifications to leach fields, and they use pretty known principles to affect or get a better removal of nitrogen. So, in general, the standard septic system gets half the job done. Converts everything right under your septic leach field to nitrate. But nitrate is what causes the problems, as you know. It's very mobile. It moves in the groundwater. There's only a few things that change it, and that are dilution and dispersion. By the time it gets to your embayment, the algae are right there ready to use it. And that's not a bad thing. 90% of what you're breathing right now comes from algae-produced oxygen. If we shut that off, of course, we won't be around to tell the story. So where the problem comes is when you have very enclosed embayments where that oxygen causes so much algae growth that during the nighttime when they respire, they kill everything off. They take the oxygen out of the water, which of course fish need and shellfish need and invertebrates need, and pretty soon you have a problem with an embayment that you don't want to swim in and you certainly can't fish in. So, in general, the standard septic system runs out of carbon. And the process is pretty simple here. If you want to know nothing about chemistry, just remember this part. That little yellow liquid you deposit every day in that white porcelain bowl goes down into, and the brown stuff too, but yellow is, what the heck. That's carrying most of the nitrogen, by the way. That goes down into your septic tank. It converts in your septic tank to ammonia. The ammonia goes out to your leach field, and in your leach field, there's bacteria out there that convert it to nitrate. Through a couple steps, but it goes to nitrate. Now, how do we get it back up to nitrogen gas where, God will do the shipping and it won't hurt you? Because 80% of what you breathe in right now is nitrogen gas. So how do we get it back up there? Well, there's only one real good way to do it, is to take that nitrate, shut the air off down in the soil somehow, and feed it carbon. Food. Could be poop, could be organics left there by, years of deposit, or it could be something you purposefully put there. And that's where we came in with this system. Purposefully putting carbon beneath a leach field where it needs to go, like not right in, not going to feed your poop right to the sawdust, nothing will happen there. But after it nitrifies in a portion of soil, to turn it back to nitrogen gas, feed it carbon, shut off the air, and the nitrogen gas goes up into the atmosphere. if you remember nothing else of what I've said here, that would be the nitrogen cycle that runs everything. It runs the world. That's how, and who doesn't like nitrogen? It gives us blue skies. Who's got an objection to blue skies? So nitrogen, you want to convert what's that yellow liquid you see every morning. Some people see it for a day before they flush it away. I'm not against that, by the way. We're a household that does that. And you want that nitrogen to get back up into the atmosphere. It's got to go through a treatment process. And the message is our soils don't do it completely unless we teach them how. So, if it doesn't do the job, what if we could provide a source of carbon where it needs to be, facilitate the anoxic conditions, shut the air off after the nitrification step? If we could do that, we would convert that nitrogen in the yellow liquid back up to nitrogen gas, which is a harmless gas. You're breathing 4/5 of it right now. Some people more, some people less. And that's the goal of any treatment unit. Even the boxes in your backyard, if you have one, how many have alternative septic systems in their backyard? Yeah, so that's basically what it does. Converts it back up to nitrogen gas by sequentially putting it through that process. Nitrify to denitrify. Nitrify to denitrify. Can we all say that? Nitrify to denitrify. I'll never be a preacher. I just always wanted to hear something like that. Okay, so what does wood have to do with it? What does sawdust have to do with it? Well, it's a carbon source. We all need carbon. That's what you're going to have for dinner tonight. You're going to have carbon for dinner. You couldn't live without carbon, neither can bacteria. So it's a source of carbon. And wood, in various forms, represents a slow release of carbon for use by bacteria. That's the whole thing, putting that carbon where it needs to be and creating the conditions in which that carbon is used. You cannot go out and eat a tree. Well, you could. You wouldn't survive very long on it. I grow shiitake mushrooms, so I eat trees all the time. If you eat shiitakes, you're eating trees. You're eating what a fungi has converted that hard polymer, cellulose, into a sugar that you can then appreciate as food. The same thing happens with bacteria. Once they get by that little lignin, which is a real hard compound to break down in the wood, they can use the carbon for food. So, I want to tell you this is not new. I didn't invent it. We scabbed it from every piece of literature we can. I am essentially standing before you a glorified monkey. I can copy things. I look in everybody's research and I say, how did they manipulate the cycle? They've been doing this for years in agricultural land. When agricultural land bleeds into the groundwater nitrates, all they do is go to that stream which is being impacted, and they dig a ditch alongside of the stream far enough away so that the groundwater intercepts it. And the groundwater, because water doesn't transmit air very well underground, is anoxic. Through that wood chip bed or sawdust bed, it removes the nitrogen. Well, back in early 1990s, a Canadian gentleman, Will Robertson, Dr. Robertson at the University of Waterloo, decided he would put different things underneath a standard leach field after nitrification layer. He used corn cobs, he used shredded newspaper, he used a couple of other things, and of course he used sawdust. And he mixed it with a little silt just to slow things down and shut the air down. And he found out, and this was now, oh God, we're going on 17, 20 years, what happened, he found out, is beneath it, the nitrate disappeared. He had the nitrate above it, he looked below it, the nitrate was drastically reduced. And so he published that paper, and it sat there doing nothing for years. Then he comes back. I love professors, used to work with them, so it's not disparaging. Every 5 years they go back and republish, 5 years later, 5 years later, 7 years later. Thank God he did, because it kept surfacing in the literature. And I picked up on it somewhere around 5 or 6 years ago now. And also in the state of Florida, where they're really, I mean, it's crazy down there with nitrogen in the groundwater, they started looking at it and started configuring wood, sawdust, wood chips beneath standard leach fields, channeling it through anoxic conditions, and coming up with some pretty impressive results. So maybe 5 years ago now, I called down there because, can we talk? I mean, there's guys like me all over the country. We're just poop geeks. That's what we are. We love wastewater. We talk about it. We think about it. Actually, we create it also. Does anybody here not create wastewater? Okay. If you say, no, I don't create it, you lie about other things too. So all we did was I looked at all of the research down in Florida, and they were getting phenomenal results by just passing it through, but they used a liner underneath it to collect everything that went through the leach field, goes through this liner with wood chips, and then they needed another leach field. So I looked at all those data, and I looked at all of the things they did, and I said, look, Damon Anderson was a gentleman. I said, can we do it simpler? Have you ever tried this? And he said, nah, we'd never tried that. And I said, well, two things strike you as a difference between Florida and here. First of all, if I was in Florida, I'd walk outside with a short sleeve shirt right about now. But you know you're not going to. The temperature, the climate is different. And all wastewater is driven by bacteria. All bacteria, the rates are fixed by temperature. So I knew that I couldn't take Florida's work and just bring it up here and expect the same results. At least for 3 to 4 months of the year, I'm going to be sub-zero here as far as the zero that bacteria see, and say, okay, I'm going to have to do something different. Or will it work in the winter? I don't know. Nobody knew. Nobody really tried it. The Canadian work said, it'll work, but it'll drop its performance. And I said, okay, how much? Is it still worth doing? Because that's the whole thing. What's it all come down to? Itchy fingers? No, money. It comes down to money. We want to do it the most economical way. So they use drip dispersal down there. Drip dispersal is a great way to do things, but low pressure distribution's a third the price and still works. So we tried that and seen whether it works. So what you're about to see really is some of the experiments we did. Our challenge is to make it simple, inexpensive, sustainable, constructible, permittable, and oh yeah, it's got to work. So this is the Canadian horizontal barrier, is what it's called. Basically, leach field, 18 inches of sand or whatever will nitrify, and any sweater you're wearing here would nitrify. I mean, all you have to do is get it to grow on media, it will nitrify. And then underneath that fuzzy little area underneath, that's just a simple area mixture of sand, sawdust, and a little silt. And that slows the water up so it doesn't like scream through. It gets time to sit, have a cup of tea with the wood, start talking, maybe trade a few electrons. Next thing you know, the nitrate that's there, it's now nitrogen gas going up into the atmosphere, and not as much nitrate gets through. Pretty simple principle. So we've done a few experiments at the test center, and where we actually placed this denitrification under some sand and sawdust. Here's the construction that went on. And between the sand layer up top and the sand and sawdust layer right beneath it, we perform a marriage without the preacher. All you do is you take the sand, pour a little sand on the sand sawdust layer, and you rake them together. So we call it marrying. If you lay sod, you do the same thing. You marry the sod onto the loam. So that part there is pretty simple, just raking it out. A couple guys are raking. Next thing you know is you lay on the nitrification layer, which is just really a sandy layer on top. Next thing you want to do is put your dispersal. That's, let's see if I can do this without totally messing it up. This right here is the dispersal means a low pressure distribution. It's a product we use, but you don't have to use it. This is called Geomat. It's just a low pressure, squirts the effluent, your septic tank effluent. Yeah, and you did this before or after lunch. So it squirts the effluent into this mat, which spreads it out over the sand, and it percolates down into the sand. Then we cover it over, and that's what it looks like covered, and this is what it looks like every spring. By the way, you don't want to volunteer for this if you don't like a green lawn, because you will get a green lawn. And that's not fertilized other than what comes out of your body, out of various orifices first thing in the morning. So I always wonder about this. I say, now, I don't particularly like a green lawn because I don't like to cut grass, but if you don't cut that every week, at least once a week, you can play a little game. You could go out there in 2 weeks and do a face plant, and your nose will not hit the ground. It'll be cushioned. Please don't try this at home. But that's pretty much it. It's a standard leach field. Now, there's a lot of pipes and things you see sticking out up out of the ground there. That is because we sample everything and we try different things, so we need all of those things exposed when we do it. Because when it snows here, I want to be able to find my sampling ports so they all stick above the ground. In a normal home installation, they'd all be below ground with covers, or they'd be covered with sod and just have markers so you can get to them. So here are the data. Now this thing has gone out 1,300 days, 1,400 days. We've had it in since 2015. And the influent number there is what would come out of your house, 43.8. That's a pretty low number compared to what's probably coming out of most of your houses here. I usually see somewhere around 60. And the effluent number here is 7.1. That's an 87% removal for a simple pressure dose system in this installation. So we did another design here, very simple, septic tank, pump chamber, pressure dose system. Now this is an interesting story. I'll tell it because I have a captive audience, and that's very rare unless I tie one of my kids down. New York, Suffolk County is going through a very similar problem with it as we are. And they're looking for cheap, sustainable, inexpensive, sustainable ways to do things. And they came to us and said, what are you guys doing up there? And I said, oh, we're just copying the Canadian stuff. We're doing what we can. We're throwing these things in the ground. And they said, well, we'd like to do it down here. I said, fine. I sent them all the specifications and everything. And they said, well, we have a county health department down here, and they won't let us put them in. So I jokingly said, give me about 240 tons of your sand, and we'll put them up here. And they took me up on it. You know, what it took the glacier millions of years to bring down, 7 triaxles later, it's showing up at the gates of our place, and they said, where do you want us to put it? So we actually installed 3 of their systems at the test center, and they very much mimicked it, except it's New York sand. So it does it with an accent, but it does still remove the nitrogen. Okay, this is the design. We put some sampling ports in there, so we capture everything that goes through the system. And in profile, it looks like this. It wouldn't look like this in your house, but we have to put a bag under the whole system so we know how it performs. But we also put these little pan lysimeters underneath. This is how it would be in your backyard. We put these pan lysimeters. If you can picture my hand as being the pan, it's collecting the stuff percolating down through, collects it down by my elbow, And then my shoulder up here, I would be taking a sample from the surface. So we can actually sample these things fairly easily by installing these ports, which we would install in anybody's backyard who had this system. We don't put it in an entire big bag because we found out we don't have to have a big bag. We do at the test center because we can't allow any discharge to be discharged at the test center. So that particular system, using just straight sand, had 43 going in and 10 coming out, which is about a 75% removal. Again, this is really not using any particular treatment unit, just a pressure dose system on top of a bed of sand, which is sitting on top of an area where sand and sawdust is mixed. Oh, by the way, this is also New York sawdust, which sort of looks like the mulch, because I don't know what the deal is, because they said, well, we need to use our sawdust, and we don't have sawdust down here. I said, you guys haven't invented the sawmill yet? And they said, no, we don't have any sawmills on Long Island. I said, boy, that must be some Holland wood then. Nobody makes wood down there. So they brought up mulch, and we decided, okay, it's your money, because they pay handsomely to be at our test center. And we threw the mulch there and mixed it in. And it was an oak mulch, so like what you'd put around your flower beds. But it worked the same. Okay, what about the real world? Test center is one thing where we can go off and just shut the thing down, but we need to do some real world, so we've installed some of these out there at people's houses. And we use a couple of different configurations. For those who don't care, throw caution to the wind, we put their entire leach field with sawdust. Sawdust underneath it, nitrifying layer up on top of it, and then the grass grows on top of that. For those who are less inclined to want risk, we actually install a Title V component to it. So we install a completely legal, you can do it, Title V system. And beside it, we put a half of a wood-based system. And then we run it half and half. So we have a sampling port under the standard system and sampling ports under the wood. When we do it that way, we actually can figure out what your mind would be and what your mind would be on wood. So you can pretty much figure that's a control situation right on your lot. And we can compare that to what a standard Title V system would do. So most people have opted for throwing caution to the wind, put the whole thing under there. But we have 3 of these systems in where there's split systems, so we know what the difference is between it and a standard Title V system. And I should say, by the way, as people will ask, well, why do you use a pressure distribution? That's not that simple. I could just go gravity out of my tank. What we've found with pressure distribution, particularly in the shallow soil horizons, is we get a twofer. And who doesn't like a twofer? A 2-for-1? We get pharmaceutical personal care removal to a much higher extent in that surface layer. Actually, we get a 3-for, because you get great green lawn growing, if you want it. Well, I'm sorry, even if you don't want it. And you get even distribution over the wood chips. So that way you get pharmaceutical removal, you get much better pathogen removal, and down below in the wood, you get the nitrogen removal. So you get a 2-for at least, or a 3-for if you're a really positive thinking person, like most of you are, you wouldn't be here. Okay, this is a residential system in the town of Acushnet, and the bottom line is your standard leach field. So right during startup, they both look the same, and then afterwards they diverge quite a bit. So basically that system goes from 64 milligrams per liter, which remember I told you your numbers would be higher than 38. This is a house with 3 people. I used to say 2.5 because there's a baby in there that didn't show up till halfway through the study. So really it is 2.5. I'm not slicing. I'm not Solomon cutting the baby in half here. I'm just saying they weren't there half of the time, the baby. So it went from 64 to 12, and the other portion of the system went from, which is a standard Title V system, 64 to, say, 40. So that way we could tell there is definitely a difference. We also know, by the way, that the surface distribution system also removes nitrogen better. Part of that's going up in the grass, and you can see why it's doing better. And the other part is that it actually will denitrify in these surface layers better because the carbon gets, what happens on our lawn is a lot of nice carbon gets produced because the roots of your lawn exude, pee out, eliminate, whatever. Those are the nice ways I would put it. They exude the sugars and carbon necessary for denitrification. So they actually help denitrification a bit because those soluble sugars move down there, and that's some of the carbon source. Okay, here's system 2, Woods Hole residence 1 to 3, the startup and the final, and what that came down to, they have a little bit stronger waste. 77 goes to 29, which is about a 62% removal, and a 30% removal in the standard portion of the system, which is 77 to 54. This one was a seasonal home, which we only looked at for 2 seasons while the people were there. It was going to be a year-round residence, but due to some family circumstances, they couldn't. This went from 90 milligrams per liter. That's pretty strong waste. Not the strongest I've seen, by the way. Right down here in Wellfleet, I saw a consistent influent of 164. 164. Well, that's the kicker. There were only 2 people, and I was afraid they were grinding bodies up or something. You know, you get torn down here. You never know what's happening. Only kidding. But I did get a little hint. I got a little hint to it because I was taking the measurements one day, and I knocked on the door, and the lady of the house answered the door, and I told her what I was there for, and she, very muffled tone, said, "My husband only lets me take 1 shower every 3 days." And I thought, okay, that's going to concentrate the waste. So, you know, I'm running this through my head, doing the calculation, saying, okay, you're up to 82. How do we get the rest away? And he doesn't let us flush the toilet but once. Boom, it went right up to 164 in my head. I said, that's how you got it. I'm not going to recommend that, by the way, unless you really want to set a record. I don't know what the world record is for strength of wastewater, but I'm going to guess it's hovering somewhere around 164. Okay, system 4, this is a seasonal home. Went from 94 to 21, which is a 78% removal in the standard, in the wood chip portion. Went from 94 to 76, which is not a whole lot of good removal for a standard Title V system. So again, the hint here was that in the first year, when you use a surface distribution, you can actually see where the wastewater is going. In fact, if you went to Google Earth, you could probably see the stripes in your lawn. So if you really want a great lawn for the first year, don't get one. And I asked the young lady at the place whether they employed anybody to fertilize the lawn, because 76 coming out of a leach field 3 feet down is a pretty high number. I mean, 94 going in didn't surprise me, but 76 says there's something in between that septic tank and my sampling port. She said no, but I later found out that, yes, indeed, they had a lawn green company come in. which kind of made sense because when I went down to Rhode Island, then now this is about 15 years ago, I went to somebody with a drip system. And I was taking notes, who likes this, who doesn't like this. And I said to the gentleman, I said, you like the system? He said, I love the system. I said, you got anything wrong? He said, oh, yeah. And I said, okay, I'm getting the book ready, got my hand warmed up to write down the bad stuff. And I said, shoot, what is it? He said, you see how nice this lawn looks? And I said, yeah, it's beautiful. And he turned to the other half of his yard. He said, you see how green this lawn is? And I said, yeah, equally as beautiful. And he said, do you know how many pounds of fertilizer I have to put over there to match what's over here? I said, well, that defeats the purpose a little, sir, but yeah, I understand your problem. But this could start a whole new paradigm for when your lawn looks ratty, if you got one of these, have a beer party, invite people in, third door to the left, please flush twice, and feel free to stay a day. I'm only kidding, I don't recommend that either. So, now we did a DPW garage. This was down in Connecticut. And they had 260 going in, which ought to tell you about DPW workers. Actually, you figure a garage like that, the only thing they're really going to collect is a lot of urine because they serve a lot of coffee. No, not the coffee thing, but that's primarily what they collected. So they had 260 going in, and they had 257 at the Title V portion and 95 at below the wood chips. That's about a 62% reduction. So, treated portion, about a 78% reduction. So in essence, the layered system, I could have done this talk in like 5 minutes, and you could have, gone to a good lunch. Hey, sand sawdust, there's not much more to it. And really, it relies on age-old principles that once you nitrify to, thank you, denitrify. So you denitrify with the wood chips beneath it. And there are many questions I'm sure you have, but I'm going to ask the one that usually is the first question, shoots up. It's usually somebody in the last row. And it goes, how long will the wood last? Makes sense to ask that question. And I can clearly say with full confidence that I do not know. Because we have the saturated systems where we can collect everything in a tub underneath and hold the water. If we do that, of course, now you need to get the water out somehow, so you need another leach field around it. We know that those wood chips will last long beyond anybody in this room and anybody in this room's child or grandchild. We're pretty sure of that. Because if you keep wood saturated, you won't break it down or compost it. And if you don't believe that, I've been on Lake Michigan when they pulled up logs. They've been there since, 1750s, and those logs are like the day they put them in. But once you just allow water to percolate over it and let air at it, we don't know how much they will compost to the point where compost produces carbon dioxide and water. Well, that carbon dioxide, as it's going, is taking out the carbon. We just don't know how long. We know that Dr. Robertson's experiments in Canada have gone since the early 90s. We don't know how long ours are going. We've been running some experiments which would suggest at least 20 years, but again, we don't know. We are working with some other designs, and you've probably heard them. They're much like a Nitrex system, where we create a leach field, put it in a bag, collect everything going through it, and put it through a box of wood chips. Or if you're a Nitrex purveyor, you say a proprietary filter media created by God. And only God can make a tree. I remember that poem. So, I'm open to any of the other questions. Yes, sir.
You use the term sawdust and wood chips.
Yes.
There are two different media. Which is what you suggest?
Okay, we are suggesting sawdust. simply because it can be mixed in with the sand more uniformly. And we do that, by the way, just see two bobcat and an excavator doing a dance you don't want to see, but they can do it and just mix and flop and mix. We believe that that will fit into the soil pores better to the point where you get better exposure. And now, if the wood does accrete, if it does, dissolve or whatever, which we don't believe it will, but if it does, it won't settle as much. When any time you put sand in, and if you walk it in compaction, sand when you walk it in is probably about 95% of what you could compact it with anyhow. It'll settle about another 3%. We don't know how much this will settle. We haven't seen it settle in the years we've had our systems in, but we're not 20 years out on any of these systems. So we recommend sawdust. Wood chips, we just haven't got enough experience with them. And the mulchy material, which is kind of stringy and it's been tub grounded, we think that's probably as good as sawdust, but we're just not sure yet. I mean, the New York folks are using them and they're having good success with it, but nobody's got 20 years out here except the guy in Canada, and he used sawdust. Yes?
How thick is the sawdust sand layer?
18 inches. It's 18 inches of sand. That's to nitrify. Now, we know that 18 inches will absolutely, under pressure dosing, completely nitrify the wastewater. We know that 99% of the time, 12 inches will. And we know that a good portion of the time, 6 inches will. But 18 inches is insurance. And if you think about how things are normally constructed on Cape Cod, please, if you're a contractor, just say you're full of baloney. But generally, you're cutting out 2 or 3 feet at least, usually in my area, 4 feet. You're cutting out the AB layer, you're cutting out the silty stuff or anything that's can't perk real well. You're down 4 feet anyhow. And figure the whole vertical profile of the system is 18 plus 18 is 36, and another 9 of cover. So you're at, what, 45 if I did my math right.
Where's the gas, you have a gas vent down there in the
No,
denitrifying area?
No.
To ease the nitrogen?
well, the
escape?
nitrogen is going to move out. It's going to displace whatever gas is there. We hope that in that denite layer, it's displacing oxygen. We hope that that's the
what I meant.
case.
You had a conduit of something down there that helped take away the
Yeah.
nitrogen.
Well, no, we would want that to fill the pores down there because we don't want oxygen in the denite layer. If you have oxygen in the denite layer, you'll just compost and you'll stop your denitrification. Yes, sir.
Do you have any projections of the initial cost of constructing one of these things for a typical home?
Okay, yes.
Do you have any projections of the ongoing annual cost? And do you have any projections of what the cost per kilogram of nitrogen removed would be?
Okay.
And how that would compare with a gravity sewer system, for example?
All good questions. So he's asked the cost of it initially to install it, the cost of operating and maintaining it, and the cost per pound of nitrogen. The last one, I cannot answer that because we're not sure what number we would settle at. But let's get to the first one, the cost of installing it. An installer in Falmouth installed 3 of these systems now for us at fairly tricky sites, ones with some site constraints. One had to, for instance, strip out down 12 feet. He had to take that stuff out anyhow. So for that particular system, he said the only additional cost he would have been to buy the sawdust and mix it on site. And he said that would all be less than $1,000.
But that's for a new system.
Yes.
But if you're to install this, retrofit an old system. the cost
So
would be
a
different.
retrofit to an old system, it would depend on a number of 2 things primarily. If my old system already had a pump system, it had to pump to a D-box or it was pressure distribution, and my leach field failed, and now I've got to replace it, we would be talking less than $1,000 difference. because you've already got that main part of the infrastructure there, and you're only replacing the leach field, and you're only changing out 18-inch layer of the sand for that leach field. So if you had a gravity-fed system, now you have to go to pressure dose. Let's do some rough numbers, and if I'm wrong, please, down here is really sort of wherever you are. A 1,000-gallon pump chamber is $1,000. I always go a buck a gallon. So the same price to install it, so 1,000 plus 1,000. Your control panel has to be a little bit different. It can't be your standard, control panel which just burps out whatever you feed it. As soon as the flow comes up, it shoots it out. So let's give that control panel a $600 figure and $1,000 to put in, because you never had any wires out there before. Now you got a wire into a box, and maybe some places only have 60 amp service, so now they've got to step it up. So that's 1,000 plus 1,000 extra, plus let's give it another $1,500 for the other things, which are the extra mixing and whatever. So it's hard to give you an exact number, but if you already have a gravity system, now you've got to have a 1,000-gallon pump chamber, pressure distribution network, and a control panel that is a time dose panel. So those would be your major cost of buying them and installing them. Though running them, annually, you'd probably have to have your, by code, if you have a pressure distribution, not that boards of health enforce this, but you should have an annual inspection of the pressure dose system. Electricity-wise, I think you'd be really hard-pressed to figure out. That wouldn't be, you couldn't find it in your electric bill. Because normally, like I've installed, we've got 5 now of these things in with pressure dose systems. We set them to dose for 1.5 minutes every 2 hours. So they generally are only discharging 6 times a day maximum. So figure that out with the 1/3 horsepower pump. You wouldn't be able to see it. So, because think about it, in most wastewater treatment, what's the major energy cost? It's getting air to the wastewater to do that first step, to break down. The heterotrophs need to be happy, they need air, that's it. That's a major cost. That's why people who own fast units, fixed activated sludge treatment units, complain about the electric use, because, there's 5 kilowatt hours a day pumping air into your wastewater. That's a pretty good chunk of change for some folks, compared to letting it passively get air to it by using a leach field. Your leach field is probably the most efficient transfer of air to wastewater there is out there. Yes, sir. Oh, I said I didn't know that, sir, because we're not really settled on the actual removal rate yet. We are doing some of the calculations, particularly in that home with the 212 gallons a day. We'll be able to get that right down to the penny, but we don't know yet.
Any of the costs you just described documented anywhere we can find it?
They're not yet, sir. We're putting together the report for that under a DEP grant, which ends in June, so we will have a final report on that. Yes.
Any similar magic for phosphorus, or
Well, actually, what we're doing, forgive the term, but we're doping a leach field. That's what we're doing. We're putting something in a leach field that has some reactive thing to it. With phosphorus, you could dope a leach field with iron filings and probably remove most of the phosphorus. But that's less predictable as far as how much you'd use. So, no, we have not seen that. The best strategy you can have for phosphorus removal right now, there are 2 technologies under piloting. One is called a PhosRID, which has sort of a reactive chamber to it that adds iron. It's called RID system, is reductive iron dissolution. There's another system which works very similarly by putting a bunch of steel plates, I think there's 4. They immerse into your septic tank. They run a small current through it, releasing ferrous ions combined with the phosphorus, and that goes out to your leach field where it reprecipitates in your leach field and is chemically bound. Now you'd think, well, why would I want to clog my leach field? Well, we've worked with it and not found that it clogs the leach field because the precipitate's just like a very fine precipitate that precipitates on the sand itself, and it's strygnite and vivianite and wedlite, or wedite. I can't think of that name. Don't get to be over 65. So there is no simple way, but I always say if you really want for phosphorus, keep that stuff in the upper AB soil layers and use them. Don't strip them out. What will that mean? Your leach field will be bigger because your AB layers cannot take the water. The LTARs, long-term acceptance rates, are pretty low compared to sand, which lets it scream away. But if you do that, you'll cycle the phosphorus up from the root zone up. You'll adsorb it onto the fine particles in that surface layer. And by the way, we just obtained a grant under 319 to try some phosphorus removal technologies. One of them is the iron plate one. The other one is same principle, run a small current through aluminum plate, which then, of course, the aluminum binds with the phosphorus and drops into your tank, and you pump that out with the sludge. And there's another one that has an adsorbent media to it, that after treatment, you put it through this adsorbent media, and then the media gets changed out. I don't know what the media is. It could be something like LECA, light expanded clay, because clay will adsorb phosphate and not chemically bind it. It will adsorb it. So then the light expanded clay aggregate could be reused as a soil amendment somewhere and used for phosphorus. But I'll tell you, and this is a story for you. Picture yourself, it's 1898, you're in London, stuffy old hall, and the British Academy of Sciences, the guy gets up and he says to the people, by 1930 there will be mass starvation in the world. There'll be mass starvation. And he lays it out, he lays it all out. He says if we cannot fix nitrogen into something we can use for fertilizer, we're going to run out of fertilizer. And by 1935, you'll start hitting this around the world. And it never came true simply because, as many of you may know, Haber-Bosch process came along to fix nitrogen and put it into a fertilizer, which we spread like everything today. Comes from that fertilizer process. Well, I won't make that same prediction, first of all, because this isn't a stuffy old hall and it's not 1898. But it is 2019, and I will predict that our children, and certainly my grandchildren, will see the day when phosphorus becomes as limiting as they predicted nitrogen to be. Because there is really a limited number of places we get phosphorus, and it's usually in politically unstable areas of our earth right now. And we need it to grow fertilizer. You need it to breathe. You got an energy process going on, ATP to ADP and vice versa. It's going on in your body right now. You wouldn't be breathing if it didn't. And we will see the day when the wars won't be fought over gasoline or oil. It'll be fought over phosphorus because that's food. So we're looking at our next efforts are how do you recover phosphorus from wastewater without killing people with the worst virus that they ever want to have. And somehow tying it up and binding it to something like LECA or some other thing that could be reusable. You've heard people storing their urine, right? How many have heard that? How many store their urine? Okay, so we don't have any stores here. But, urine is probably a huge source of phosphorus. It isn't economical right now because you can't extract a struvite or combine it for struvite. But someday it will be. And maybe I won't be around, but the day is going to come when they start paying you for your urine, you'll know. You'll say, that nut, he was half right. Every once in a while, even a blind squirrel finds a nut. Yes.
This is a two-part question. Is there, is this system ready for prime time with commercial and residential buyers? That's one. And is there any reason why architects, builders, and septic builders would not want to offer it to their clients as an option?
The first question drives the second answer. It's not ready for prime time because presently we're in piloting phase. And it stands in one huge variance to Title V. Title V says any sand fill or any fill you bring in must meet a certain spec and be free of fines and organic material. Wood's organic material, so you can't do it. So we have been site-specific piloting all the ones we've put in. And will it be ready for prime time at someday? Geez, I hope so, because to me, it's just simply doping a leach field. It's simply amending a leach field to provide a source of food right where it needs to be. And this speaks a little bit to anybody here considering doing this on a volunteer. What's your risk? Your risk is unlikely that you'll ever have a hydraulic issue. It's unlikely that what we do at the wood down there will present to you a hydraulic constraint that your wastewater won't go away. Will it always denitrify forever and ever, or for 20 years, or for 15 years? That's the big question. So what we've done, and you may fault us for that, I wouldn't mind you, because at this age, I'm third base heading for home, so, once I see the sliding path, I'm good, is you can fault us for that, but we really need to find out this information, because this is a pretty simple means of removing nitrogen, and what we'll be doing more in the near future, we're trying to get folks to figure out whether this also is a means to remove pharmaceuticals and personal care products. You say, why on earth would you connect those two? And here's why. You didn't want to know this, but I'm going to tell you anyhow, because I have a captive audience. So, in order for the bugs to use the carbon, that is the cellulose in wood, they must break out the outer capsule. The outer capsule is something called lignin. That lignin is a compound like you have never seen before. If you see it, it'll give you a headache. You'd say, know what it looks like? It looks like what I did to my mother's ball of yarn one day when I strung it out across the yard and then hurriedly tried to put it back together. That's what it looks like. It's a molecule that the bugs look at it and say, I'd love to have that carbon. Like my mother said, I'd love to make that sweater for you, but I can't, because I can't decipher it. I can't pull it apart. Well, there are many bugs that have little enzymes called lacases, and they look at that and say, it's not too bad. I think I can unravel that, and they do it. It's some of the most complex chemistry around. They can disassemble it and make a sugar and a mushroom that you can eat. It reassembles it into these nice phenolic compounds that we say, hey, these taste pretty good. So if they look at any compound we make, a pharmaceutical, an estrogen, and guys, we all make estrogen. I'm sorry to tell you, we all pee it out. They look at the estrogen and say, piece of cake. That's not even a wrapped up bottle of yarn. They can disassemble it. And now they're looking at some of the compounds we make so proudly and call them chemicals that improve our lives, and now are causing some problems when they get in the groundwater. They're looking at those compounds saying, not so bad for us, we can unravel that. So we believe that a lot of the same compounds that are affecting denitrification, that are ripping apart the lignin on the outside of that nice cellulose hot dog in there, they can also look at some of the advanced compounds that we're throwing at them and say, looks like carbon to me, and they eat it. So that's what we're hoping. I'm sorry, I got off there. Yes?
Make any sense to put this on, in conjunction with a system like the FAST system?
Yes, well, it can be put on that. If you were going to do that, you might as well create the the box of wood chips after it. Why would you say that? Well, if I got to replace the wood under your leach field, I got to rip up your leach field. But if I've got all the nitrified effluent in one spot, just feed it into a box of wood chips. Upflow it, by the way. You'd have to keep the wood chips wet, so you feed at the bottom and then it comes out the top and goes to your leach field. That is, in fact, the Nitrex, which is a commercial unit. That you don't have to buy that commercial unit because the patent of that expired years ago. It's basically a box of wood chips, or unless you're selling Nitrex, and it's a box of proprietary cellulose material placed together by a benign creature who made a tree. And your leach field, yes. Now, the one thing,
For a septic system too?
pardon?
Would you put the wood chip box, saturated wood chips right after the septic too?
You couldn't put it right after the septic tank because what do you need to do before you nitrify, folks? Nitrify to denitrify. What's coming out of your septic tank is ammonia. It's not nitrified. Yes.
So, if I understand correctly, we have a technology that works, but we have regulations that prevent it being used.
Okay, let me rephrase that. We have a technology that is being tried to see whether it works, and we have a regulatory authority which is making darn sure it does before it lets it out of the barn. So that's how I characterize it. And believe me, I mean, I don't particularly like that, but, no.
Given this, is there anything that we can do that can assist the powers that be?
We have a volunteer right here.
Well,
See,
actually,
because the only thing that drives decisions, what should drive your decision to do anything? Good data. Good, you call it good information, I call it data. And I think that as much as I sort of bemoan sometimes our regulatory process that doesn't allow good innovation to fly forward, I've worked at the test center 20 years, started the test center 20 years ago. And I will say there's about 5% of the people who come through there with the product that absolutely know it will work. And I'm sorry, I end up saying at the end of the day, that dog won't hunt, take it home.
so if I could just add
Oh,
to that,
yeah, I'm sorry.
one of the reasons we're interested in hearing George's discussion today is the town, in terms of our wastewater planning for FY20 for next year, is going to request some of the funding go towards installation of pilot demonstration systems that can be monitored for efficiency and effectiveness in our town. So that's part of the introduction today to this discussion. Also to inform the engineers in the audience and the installers in the audience to give them some indication on how difficult or easy this is to install, and to solicit volunteers that are in the specific watershed of concern to see, do these pilots work in our backyard? I mean, George has shown you examples from other areas of the Cape where they are working. So this is a component of our wastewater plan moving forward. And, hopefully, if on a small scale, this provides the Department of Environmental Protection with additional information so that they can make an evaluation that these pilot systems can move to the next level. Probably take time and data, as George is suggesting, but that's why we're discussing this today. Is this, something Eastham should do? I feel that the answer is yes. Our wastewater consultant thinks this is a valuable, non-traditional approach to evaluate further. And so the first step is going to be, we can subsidize the extra cost that a homeowner can incur, similar to what George did with grant funding. Unfortunately, that grant funding is no longer available for our community, but I think it's a valuable step in the right direction, and we will need people to volunteer to do that. So that's where we are. We have to wait for budget approval for the fiscal year 2020, and then we would be looking for volunteers to step forward. And also, a component of this will be, I'm sure that the installers in the audience have some questions. As George installs some of these other systems that are in line, maybe I can facilitate an opportunity for them to go out to those sites, see how they're installed, see the the approach used to mix the matrix. And George has offered to do oversight in our town if we get volunteers in specific sites selected. So.
Yes, sir.
Given the scale of the TMDL requirements that the state has established for the estuary, and the number of properties that are in the watersheds that are feeding towards that target reduction, are the reductions that you get through this technology sufficient to meet those TMDL?
Of course, that's going to be specific to the TMDL, whatever the TMDL is. And then what will have to happen is there'll have to be some frank assessment of, they're going to have to assign some number to it based on the data. So if you need to get 95% removal, the answer to your question would be no. If you want to get, I mean, where I would feel comfortable, if somebody said, I need to get absolutely 75% removal, I'd say, yeah, I said you could use these. If I had it attached to the box, like we just talked about, somebody asked about the FAST system or any other system with a box wood chips after it, which is basically the Nitrex, and they said we need to get 85% removal, I'd say, yeah, you could do it with that. Then it's up to DEP to decide how many you would have to monitor to, it's trust but verify kind of thing. So it just depends. I always say that it all depends on what that TMDL bears as far as a percent removal. If I have to go from 0 to 60 in like 6 seconds, I don't buy, 32 Ford, I buy a Ferrari. But if I can take my time getting there, I buy my old truck. So it just depends on how fast you have to go or how much you have to get. I would say this thing clearly is shooting at 75% plus. The second design, which is this system with a wood chip box following a nitrifying system, I'd say you're up over 90% there. And there's also one I didn't discuss here, which is catches everything under the leach field and lets it pour out the sides. I would say that's definitely tracked toward 80%, but I don't know whether that is as simple as it needs to be to meet a cost point. See, the cost point we were shooting at, cheapest it could be, least expensive it could be. And there's not a whole lot of expense if, as I said, and I mentioned to this gentleman, that if you already have a pump system all set and your leach field just blew out of the ground, then this isn't a whole lot of expense beyond that other than changing your panel out and mixing some wood chips. Any other questions? Well, I got mine out of Carver because there was a, a saw mill down there. Sawmills aren't as popular anymore because they waste a lot of wood, but a circular sawmill, I mean. But we have not had any trouble finding them out of those. And here's a question nobody asked. I thought this would be like the fourth question from the middle of the room, would have been, what kind of wood? Ah, see, fourth, you're there. You're right there, fourth from the back. We have not found any difference between pine and oak. We just haven't found it. And a recent meta-study done showed that there was no difference between really pine and oak. We have a lot of oak trees that are going south along here in the Cape. So if we could get oak chips, that would be better. Intuitively, I always thought oak would be better, but we've only, the pine ones we've done work just as well. Yes?
This is a political question, but I want your scientific insight.
Uh-oh.
The town's Orleans and Eastham are under pressure by the state to clean up Nauset Marsh. If we installed in that Eastham watershed that feeds into the marsh, systems of this type in every household. And I know nitrogen moves very quickly, but how long would it take for that to clean up Nauset Marsh?
Wow, that's not a political question at all. That's a hydrogeological question, because the legacy that's in the ground moves at a certain rate and produces a certain impact. That's a foot a day is sort of the general thing. You could pull out of your wallet and say, yeah, a foot a day. So how many, whatever the distance is from that worst point carrying the worst amount of nitrogen, which I don't know where it is going to take a foot a day to work its way out. Now, although I can say that quite quickly, can we talk? When has nature ever obeyed man's principles? I mean, yeah, I know that if I drop this pen, it will hit the ground. But I also know that if I water my wife's plants religiously the way I should, they do not always come out the way they should. So nature does not obey our principles. And we have projected very conservatively what we need to do to remove the nitrogen to make the bay respond the way we want it to. I hope we're right, but I'm a biologist by life, by trade. I was raised right through fisheries and everything, and I realized that you could do everything right and it comes out wrong. And you could do everything wrong and it comes out right. And I think our Creator had that in mind when he said, you really think you know it all? But our best guess says a foot a day, that slug will go through, and if we remove the nitrogen, there's some very good work out of Florida, and you can find it. It's the Fosner study. Florida on-site septic system nitrogen removal, Fosner. And they did a nice little plume at a house where they installed one of these units. And the nice plume looks, and it's, of course, red means bad. Yellow means hurry up and get through there. But so red, green, yellow, and then over years it shows that plume dissipating in about a year and a half. But that thing was right on the water. So less is better with nitrogen. Less is not better with the tax return.
I'm curious why the current regulations don't allow organic matter.
I think for the most part, it was a settling piece, because let's say we all know the human nature. What would you put in your sand if you wanted to make it cheaper? You know, you got to bring in this fill. Maybe you'd throw a few ground up stumps in there. Maybe you'd throw more than a few in there. Maybe pretty soon the sand goes down to like 10% and the organic matter comes up to 90. So rather than have a spec that everybody had to check on, what's the easiest thing to do? Title V sand, which is basically ASTM C33 sand, a standard everybody knows. You could go and you could get a little ticket that ASTM C33, less than 2% fines. It was an easy spec. So I suspect that's what they've done. But if you looked across the country and you've seen people of states have had that same thing, they actually let you lay the sand up on top of a natural organic layer. How do you figure that? And, you know, this system's here in town because, you know, before Jane was health agent, we used to cover down here quite a bit. And you'd see layers of peat underneath there. You know, and you know that a couple feet down is a layer of organic material. It's a little resistant to breakdown, but it's going to be there. That's the thing. Once you feed wastewater down there, or once you feed wastewater onto organic material, boy, you can really light it up, so to speak. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, sure.
You said the bottom of the system would be roughly 43 inches below grade?
Yeah, somewhere around 46 inches,
So
I thought I
we'd still
said.
be looking for 5-foot separation?
Okay, there is a really good question, because I've gone back and forth, and if there's any angst I have with any sort of regulation, that's it. I'm giving 18 inches of sand, Title V sand, but I don't get credit for that. And I'm giving 18 inches more of sand and sawdust at 50-50 mix. I should get 9 inches of credit, but I don't. No, it's going to be 5 feet from the bottom. However, the systems that we've installed have been 2 feet to groundwater with a local variance required. DEP was asked about that. So we don't get the full credit. It would be nice to have 5 feet beneath it.
I just feel that a lot of these homes that you trying to get this product to.
Absolutely, they're going to be close to groundwater. Yep. So we installed one recently down in Westport, because it covered the SNP area, was in Westport, and it was 2 feet to groundwater, 2.5 feet to groundwater, and from the bottom of the actual system. Because one thing we have added to this is to layer pea stone beneath it. Why do we do that? Because what happens when the water goes through sand, if it hits a layer of pea stone, it'll hang up. You'd think it would scream through, but it doesn't. There's a textural break, so it holds a layer of saturation above that. We want that in the wood chips. We want it to stay saturated in the wood chips. So we've actually put that into our design, a 2-inch layer of pea stone. But the ones you saw, the ones at the test center, we never did it, and we're still getting the same results. We're just trying to enhance it. We're still tweaking the design a little bit. But that's pretty insignificant design change.
Following along with what you're saying, a lot of these septic systems that are being designed, these homes need containment walls because they're gonna raise it above that 5-foot water level.
Right.
So you're saying that this could possibly eliminate a lot of the containment walls?
No, what I'm saying that is that it can't do that. You'd still have to meet 2 feet to groundwater minimal at the bottom of that sand layer. So you'd probably be the same, and somebody had a containment wall, they'd probably still have a containment wall. But you know, the one thing we've been thinking about is the best wood sort of carbon source is one that's saturated all the time. So, you know, at some point, we want to play with the idea of installing the wood chips in the water table, in the sandy water table. Now you'd only have to make sure whatever percolated down, which was nitrified, went through the wood chips instead of just along the top at the water table. So you'd have to figure out how to do that with either a liner around the whole thing to funnel it all down through the wood chips. Because if you can get it to go through the wood chips, it'll denitrify. There's no doubt about it. So we, at the test center, one of our next experiments when we get a chance is going to be to raise the water table under one of our systems to see what happens. Because we can do that. We got big, I mean, all our systems are in huge 40 by 20 foot bathtubs because we can't let anything discharge. So we're going to try shutting the discharge off and letting the water table build up and see what it does. Our first initial foray on that said, yeah, it works great. But, you know, then would be what is the design feature to get it after perked, not to just ride along the top of the water table, but to say, okay, wood chips down there, get it to go down. And like I say, if you made like a, for lack of a better word, a funnel with a big mouth to get it to go down, then it would have to go down and through the wood chips. But if you can invent that, please. That's the nice thing about the test center. We have, bring that thing in. Bring it on in. We'll try it. Yes.
So from a regulatory basis, right now, these systems can only be installed on a trial.
In pilot, yes, in pilot phase.
Pilot basis. Is there anyone in particular working on that regulatory roadblock, or is it just kind of out there, or are we actually trying to change that organic proportion rule so that we could move forward?
That's an excellent question. What we're doing with all the systems we're installing, because you are required to do this under your piloting approval, is turning all those data into the Commonwealth and saying, what now does this mean? When can we move forward in the regulatory process? After a while, we're going to have enough of these in that they say, well, it doesn't appear that the organic matter in the fill is really hurting anything. Why don't we establish a standard for it that can be verified? And so part of our SNP grant, which is a large grant we got to put some of these things in to begin with, is to use George Loomis, who is in Rhode Island, who has written regulations for the Commonwealth on bottomless sand filters. He's going to be writing the guidelines for the state as a draft guideline and say, okay, here are the data. They seem to support this particular strategy. Can we do it? So, yeah, it's not like, is there anything we can do? We are doing it. And those data feed into a process, which is a process which takes things from concept to field trial to regulation.
So is that, for those of us who are trying to figure out whether this is something that we could make actionable in our budgets in 2 years or 5 years, is Loomis physically working on it now? Do we expect him to come up with an initial proposal in the near future?
He will, within the next year, start to draft that for the Commonwealth based on the information. We're working with the University of Rhode Island, particularly on a couple of sites where they're really dissecting these things. If you could see that one at Acushnet Home, that has more sensors in that system. They can tell what those folks ate for dinner and what gas they produce from it. Because one of the things we were initially concerned with, I know this gets a little bit in the weeds, but when you denitrify, you go up to nitrogen gas. That's pretty harmless. But if you only partially denitrify, university down in Stony Brook University comes up monthly, or quarterly, I'm sorry, to measure our gas emissions off the tops of our system. And right now, it's looking like these produce no more nitrous oxide proportionally than a treatment plant does. It's a very small portion of nitrous oxide. But there are conditions under which they will produce more. So we're trying to optimize and say, okay, what if we cut back on a loading rate? Or what if we did it a little differently, dosed it differently? So we're sort of looking at the whole thing. What gases are produced? Is this beneficial? Is it cheap? Is it inexpensive? Is it creating a worse problem? Or the operational nightmares, if there are any, things like that. I mean, what I've given you here is a pretty brief and sort of overview of what we do. But if you come to the test center, I could really bore the crap out of you.
Literally.
But if we're talking about 15 or perhaps 20 years of layer cake testing, and we're just now getting to the point where Mr. Loomis might be able to
Yes.
propose a regulation
To
for,
propose a regulation change.
are we for phosphorus 20 years away from the phosphorus system?
Well, I don't think we're that far away from it on phosphorus because the industry gets driven by demand. Everybody's been looking at nitrogen around the country, and now some of the lakes, particularly with HABs, harmful algae blooms, they're looking at phosphorus in freshwater. So we started looking at it, and I looked at the technologies. There aren't many out there. So now, with this grant, we'll be able to put some of those things in. I think we're close with phosphorus, closer, because phosphorus is more, I don't want to say it the wrong way, but tangible. It, first of all, is a gift that keeps on giving. There's no gaseous phase unless, of course, you're a terrorist making phosgene. But you can combine phosphorus, reuse phosphorus. The challenge with phosphorus, I believe, is how do you not waste it? Let's face it, folks. I hope the day is coming when wastewater isn't even in our dictionary. It's just water. But nitrogen, I mean, that horse ran down the field a long time ago, and we're trying to bring that puppy back. Phosphorus, we should be really working hard on now for ways to recover, reuse phosphorus. I think we're very close to being able to treat it because electrochemically, bind it with aluminum. What are you doing to some of your ponds there? Put alum out there, locks up the phosphorus, puts it in the sediments, doesn't let it mineralize into phosphate. You're golden. You can keep the blooms away. But what have you done? And look, I'm not judging it, but you lock the phosphorus up. We really need to think about long-term strategy for saying, let's recover some of this stuff. And yeah, okay, collecting urine, everybody laughs. Okay, but I know there's somebody in this room who's putting that on their compost pile. Come on, you're all right, yeah. Why? Because you know you don't want to waste that phosphorus. It's a yellow liquid, it's gold, it really is. And we need to get rid of it from our wastewater before it gets into the ponds. But the technology is there. Those aren't adopted in Massachusetts. That will be fast-tracked, I'm pretty sure, because most of that is fairly easy chemistry to prove. It's not biologically driven. And there's two technologies right there with aluminum and iron. There's a phosphrid system, which is maybe a little bit big and cumbersome. And there's also surface. And besides, I can't not say this. The easiest way to get phosphorus out, composting toilets. I'm sorry, it is. Composting toilets. We got a sustainable way to do it. Ties it up in a compost, some in a little tea, perhaps a bad metaphor there. But you've got it bound right there. You could reuse it. It could be a soil amendment. And it's not an outhouse in your house anymore anyhow. It's, you know, it's a viable alternative that I say anybody who's got ponds do it.
Aren't they already doing that in space, like on the space station, they're drinking their pee, aren't they?
Well, they're definitely taking the water out of it and reusing it. A very expensive process, unfortunately. You know, believe me, you want to drink your pee or drink what comes out of your septic tank, you could do it easily. It's just costs you a lot of money. You know, just successively go through membrane filtration till you get to nanofiltration. And then, hey, bon appetit, you know, mix it with a little gin, just so you know.
So just to summarize, you believe that the phosphorus removal technology, that which might help our ponds, could be on a faster track than
Yes.
what we waited for nitrogen. So it might be an element that we might put within our budget in a 5 to 6 years.
Yes, absolutely, because right now, the only thing keeping phosphorus technologies out of the approval process is nobody's demanding them, so who will go through a process which is somewhat like a colonoscopy to get an approval for something nobody will buy. So, you know, we've ginned up a little interest. The grant we got, for instance, I went to each of the manufacturers and asked for free equipment, free systems. Over $140,000 of equipment gets donated under this grant. That was a great match. That was like falling off a log. Who wouldn't give me money for doing that if the industry is behind it? So we'll be bringing in 3 or 4 of the iron systems. There's one, by the way, already in Brewster. It's not under this grant, but it is in Brewster using the iron. There'll be a couple under the aluminum one, which is a company out of Canada. They're both Canadian companies, actually, Waterloo Biofilter, and I can't think of the name of the other company right now. And then the surface distribution stuff, we're just going to have people start trying it, because that's a very good way. It doesn't get rid of it. But it does cycle it up where you can see it. And, you know, if you can turn brown into green, most people like that. If it's not this kind of green, it's like, boy, a beautiful garden. Think about that. Yes.
I guess just maybe one more question?
One more question.
So if phosphorus is valuable out of short supply, why aren't we dredging at the bottom of our ponds?
Because it's not quite at the point where that makes money sense. But I'm saying in our lifetime, it will get that. Certainly my child's lifetime. My grandkids will be going, hey, remember Grandpa, he was muttering about this thing in Mandarin Chinese. Yeah.
Well, I just thank George, and I'm sure we'll.
Thank you.